She gave him her loyalty before she gave him her name. She bled for his wars, starved through his winters, stood at his right side when every lord in the north wanted him dead. And the night she walked into her own chambers and found him there, tangled in silk that smelled of another woman, she did not scream. She did not cry. Luna Serafina Vale looked at the man she had built a kingdom with, and she felt something far more dangerous than grief. She felt clarity. Drop your city in the comments below and stay until the very last word, because this story is only just beginning. The storm had been building since mid-afternoon. Serafina had watched it come in from the high window of the war room, the way she watched most threats, quietly, without letting the watching show on her face. The clouds had moved in from the Ashfin Ridge like a slow army, eating the light in long gray strips until the horizon was nothing but smear and darkness. By the time the first thunder cracked over the capital of Vorn, the torches in the courtyard below were guttering sideways, and the sentries had pulled their cloaks tight and stopped pretending to look alert. She had not left the war room for 6 hours. The dispatches were spread across the oak table in rough order of urgency. Border reports from the eastern garrisons, a trade complaint from the Merchant Guild in Kelport, 2 unsigned letters she had already set aside because unsigned letters from within the palace walls were never about trade, and her hand moved across them with the same mechanical precision she brought to everything. Read, assess, decide. She had learned that habit from necessity long before she learned it from any advisor. Back when she was still Serafina of the secondary house, the daughter of a lord who drank himself to irrelevance, a girl with no inheritance and no protection and no weapon except the speed of her own thinking. She had been 17 the first time she sat at a table with men 3 times her age who expected nothing from her. She had been 20 the first time one of them admitted, through clenched teeth, that she had been right. She was 29 now, and she had stopped counting the admissions. The door opened behind her without a knock. She did not look up. "The King's Outriders crossed the Greyford Bridge 2 hours ago," said Calla. Her head steward's voice carried the particular flatness of someone who had delivered enough bad news to learn how to strip the color out of words. "At that pace, he'll make the city gate before the 3rd bell." "Weather?" "Slowing them, not stopping them." Serafina set down the trade complaint, picked up the next dispatch. "Have the east wing prepared, not the king's suite. He'll want the lower hall fire lit and food set before he's even through the gate." "Already done." "And Calla," she said it without turning, "the Wolfguard captain, Marin, tell her I want the rotation doubled on the inner ward tonight." A pause. Small, but Calla had been with her long enough to understand that pauses cost something. "Any particular reason, my Luna?" "Call it instinct." Calla left without pressing further. That was another thing Serafina had built over years. Staff who understood the difference between a question that needed an answer and a question that needed silence. She returned to the dispatches. The unsigned letters sat at the edge of the table where she had pushed them, their wax seals already broken by her letter knife. She had read them twice. The first was a single line. "The arrangement moves forward regardless of the king's return." The second was longer and more careful and twice as vague, full of the kind of language men used when they wanted the meaning to exist but the evidence not to. It mentioned an understanding between houses. It mentioned the Luna's continued cooperation. It mentioned a window of opportunity best not wasted. She had set them aside. Not because she didn't understand what they meant. Because she understood exactly what they meant and needed to think before she acted, and acting on anger before thinking was a mistake she had made once in her life, at 17, and she had paid for it in ways she still occasionally felt in her chest on cold nights. The thunder came again, closer now. She heard it move through the stone of the palace like something alive, a long, low tremor that made the torches dip and the candles throw wild shadows across the ceiling. Outside, the storm had fully arrived. She could hear the rain beginning, first as individual strikes against the high windows, then as a continuous weight, a sound like an army marching on slate. Darius was 2 hours out in that. She let herself think about him for exactly as long as it took to roll the dispatches and tie them with cord. Then she stopped. Yes. The negotiations at Thornwall had taken 3 weeks instead of 2. She had known they would. Lord Karen Ashvale was the kind of political mind that measured every hour as a resource and spent them accordingly, and sitting across a treaty table from Darius and Baud, who had a king's instinct for force and a king's impatience for process, would have been exactly the kind of friction that stretched timelines. She had told Darius that before he left. He had kissed her forehead and called her the most exhausting woman in the north and left anyway, without the additional advisor she had recommended. She had managed the capital in his absence the way she always managed it, firmly and without announcement. The nobility had tested her in the first week, the way they always tested her when Darius was away. A lord who arrived late to council, a merchant who tried to renegotiate a contract she had already closed, a younger heir who made a comment at dinner about the Luna's duties in a tone that made the table go quiet. She had responded to each of them the same way. Not with anger, with the specific, patient, surgical precision of a woman who understood that the damage you did quietly outlasted the damage you did loudly. By the second week, the lateness stopped. The contracts held. The heir had found a reason to be out of the capital. She had not needed Darius's name once. This was something she did not say aloud to anyone. The third bell had already rung by the time she finally left the war room. The palace corridors were quieter than usual. The storm was doing that, driving the servants to shorter routes and the guards to sheltered posts. She moved through the east passage with 2 of her personal guard at the standard distance, close enough to be useful and far enough back that she could hear herself think. The floors here were older stone, the joints not quite flush, and her boots found every uneven edge in the dark. She had walked this passage so many times that she knew the count by feel. She did not need light for it. She had intended to go to the hall. She was going to change out of the day's clothes, add a second layer against the cold, and then go down to the lower hall and wait for her husband to come through the gate. That had been the plan. 12 minutes in her chambers, then to the hall. She reached the door of her private chambers. The guard outside, a young man named Tor, who had been on her rotation for 2 months, was not at his post. She stopped. The hallway behind her was empty. Her 2 personal guards had stopped at the corridor junction 10 yards back per standard protocol. Ahead of her, the door to her chambers was closed, and in the thin strip of light beneath it, she could see what should not have been there. A second light source. Not cold, warm, a fire lit inside. She had not ordered a fire in her chambers tonight. She had been in the war room. Calla had orders for the east wing and the lower hall. There was no reason for a fire to be lit in her private chambers. No instruction she had given, no routine that would have put one there. She thought about the unsigned letters. She put her hand on the door. It opened without sound. She had always kept the hinges oiled herself, a habit from years ago, from a time when quiet access to a door was not a luxury, but a necessity. The fire in the hearth was burning high, too high, the kind of fire someone had stoked recently and not long ago, and the light it threw moved across the room in orange waves. She saw the bed. She saw what was in it. She stood in the doorway for a moment that lasted much longer than a moment. Her body was completely still. Her hands had dropped to her sides. She was aware of the rain hitting the window to her left, aware of the weight of the air in the room, aware of the smell. Pine smoke and something else, something sweeter, perfume she did not wear. And she was aware of the exact precise instant when her mind caught up with her eyes and the thing she was seeing became real. Darius. And a woman she did not recognize. The woman was wearing Seraphina's robe, the deep blue one, the one with the silver hem, the one Calla had mended twice and kept on the hook beside the wash basin. It was open at the shoulder. The woman was sleeping, or pretending to sleep, her dark hair spread across the pillow that belonged to Seraphina, her face turned away, her breathing slow and visible in the firelight. Darius was awake. He had seen her in the doorway. His face, in the split second before he composed it into something controlled, was a map she could read too well. She had spent 9 years reading that face. What she saw in it was not guilt. What she saw was calculation. The precise, rapid calculation of a man deciding how to handle a situation that had gone sideways. A man who had spent years knowing that his Luna was the most difficult person in the North to manage and was now trying to figure out what version of this story could still be saved. She watched him decide. She watched him open his mouth. She closed the door, not with force, with the exact amount of pressure required to move the door through its arc and seat it back in the frame. She heard the latch click. She stood in the corridor outside the room with her hands at her sides and the sound of rain filling everything. Behind her, her 2 guards had come to the corridor junction and stopped. They could not see her face. They could see her posture, the straightness of her spine, the set of her shoulders, and they were experienced enough to read it the way they would read any field signal. Neither of them said a word. Seraphina stood there for 5 seconds. 10. She was aware of her own breath, the rhythm of it, steady and low, and she made a deliberate choice not to let it change. She was aware of the exact quality of the silence in her chest where something else had been a moment ago, and she catalogued it the way she catalogued everything, without sentiment, without permission for it to spread. She had built things before from ground that other people said was ruined. She knew what the first step looked like. "Get me Marin," she said. Her voice came out level. Not flat. Flat was its own kind of signal. Level. The voice she used in council when she had already made the decision, and the talking was just confirmation. One of the guards was gone before the sentence finished. Marin arrived in under 3 minutes. She was a compact woman, 40 or so, with the kind of face that had been through weather both literal and otherwise, and come out harder for it. She served as captain of the Wolf Guard, the inner ring of palace security that answered directly to the Luna's house. She had served Serafina for 6 years. She entered the corridor with no visible surprise at the scene, her Luna standing outside her own chambers in the same clothes she'd worn all day, face unreadable, 2 guards at parade rest, and stopped at arm's length. "My Luna." "Seal the gates," Serafina said. Marin did not blink. "All gates?" "Every gate that opens to the city, the merchant entrance, the service tunnel at the south wall, the old postern on the Ridge Road. I know you've been using it for the supply runs. Seal that too. I want no one in and no one out of the capital until I say otherwise." Marin held her eyes for 1 second. Then, "It'll take 20 minutes to reach all posts." "Make it 15. "Done." She turned to go. "Marin." She stopped. "The outriders who came ahead of the king's party. Where are they now?" "Barracks, most of them. 3 were sent back with a message about 2 hours ago." "Sent back by whom?" "I don't know. The gate log will show." "Get me the gate log before you seal anything, and bring me the guard who is on rotation outside my chambers tonight. His name is Tor." Marin's expression shifted, just slightly, in a way that said she was connecting lines she hadn't connected until this moment. "Understood." She left at the pace of someone who had stopped thinking and started executing. The door behind Serafina opened. She did not turn immediately. She heard Darius come out, the sound of his boots, the specific weight of his step, the way his breathing changed when he was about to speak in the register he used when he believed he could still redirect a situation. She knew that register. She had heard him use it on lords who were losing arguments they hadn't realized they'd already lost. "Serafina." She turned. He was dressed. He had taken time to pull on trousers and a shirt, unbuttoned at the throat, and the fact that he had taken time to dress before coming out was itself information. He was standing in the doorway with one hand on the frame, and in the firelight from the room behind him she could see his face fully now. The jaw, the tired lines under his eyes, the specific look of a man who had decided that sincerity was the play. Darius Thorne was not an ugly man. He had never had to be. 6'3", the kind of build that came from actual work rather than the performance of it, dark hair gone slightly longer than he usually kept it after 3 weeks on the road. He had ruled the North for 11 years, and it showed in the way he took up space, not arrogantly, exactly, more like a man who had forgotten that rooms could exist without him in the center. She had found that quality magnetic once. She looked at him now and felt something that was not quite anger. Anger was heat. This was colder. This was the feeling of watching a foundation crack and knowing you had already started calculating what to build in its place. "Before you say anything," he said, "I'm not stopping you." He took a breath. "What you walked in on is not what it appears." "Tell me what it appears to be." He came a step forward. She did not step back. She simply watched him. The situation at Thornwall was more complicated than the dispatches suggested. There are factions within Ashvale's court that we cannot negotiate with directly. Certain conversations require intermediaries. She is an asset, not... "She is wearing my robe," Serafina said. Silence. "My robe, Darius. The one that hangs beside my wash basin in my private chambers. Not a guest chamber, not the wing we use for visiting dignitaries. My chambers, which no one enters without my order, which were locked when I left this morning, which your man Tor was apparently paid to unlock." She paused. "Let that sit. I don't need you to tell me what an intermediary is. I need you to tell me how she got into my chambers, into my bed, wearing my robe, before you arrived through the city gate." He said nothing. She waited, giving him the full length of the silence because she had learned a long time ago that silence was its own kind of force, and the person who broke it first was the person who needed something. "How long?" he said finally. "How long what? Have you known something was wrong?" She looked at him for a moment, then she almost laughed. "Darius, I have known something was wrong since the first unsigned letter arrived 4 days ago. I have been giving you the benefit of the doubt while watching your outriders send messages back to someone inside this palace before you were even through the gate." She let the quiet return for just a beat. "I gave you more credit than that situation deserved." He ran a hand over his jaw. "The letters are currently in the war room with everything else." She turned away from him, toward the far end of the corridor. "Whatever story you brought back from Thornwall, you'll have time to think about which parts of it are still usable. The gates are sealed." She heard him go still behind her. "You sealed the, He stopped himself. Started again. "Seraphina, sealing the capital gates without the king's authority." She said it before he could. "Yes, that is what I did. Luna's authority, which is separate, as the House Compact clearly specifies, and which I have every right to exercise in matters that pertain to the security of the palace and the persons within it." She stopped walking, but did not look back. "If you believe I exercised it wrongly, you are welcome to raise it with the council when I summon them." The pause behind her was different now, less calculation. Something else in it. The particular quality of silence from a man who had just understood that the conversation he thought he was walking into was not the one that was actually happening. "You're going to summon the council," he said, "in the morning." "Seraphina." "In the morning," she said again, and the repetition was not argument, it was closure. She walked to the end of the corridor. Her 2 guards fell in behind her without a word. She did not look back at him. The gate log came to her in the lower hall. She sat at the long table with a cup of water she had not drunk from, and the fire built up on her right side and Marin across from her, and she read the log with the same method she brought to everything, sequentially, without skipping ahead, marking the places where the record felt smooth when it should have felt rough. The south postern opened at the second bell, 3 hours before Darius arrived. Closed 12 minutes later. The duty guard had logged it as a supply delivery, but supply deliveries at the second bell in a storm were not standard, and the name signed against the authorization was a name she did not recognize. "Who authorized the secondary gate pass?" she asked. Marin placed a second document beside the first. "That name, Aldrich Vane, he's listed as a steward in Lord Casveth's household." Seraphina set the log down. Casveth. She ran through him in the time it took to draw one breath. Lesser lord of the inner court, old family, recently acquired debts she happened to know about because she knew about most things involving the lesser lords of the inner court. The kind of man who looked for leverage the way other men looked for exits. The kind of man who would write unsigned letters. She thought about the second letter, a window of opportunity best not wasted. "Wake up Casveth's house steward," she said. "Not Casveth, his steward, the one who actually runs the household accounts. I want him here before the 4th bell." Marin made a note. "And the woman in my chambers." Seraphina paused. "Treat her as a guest. I want her comfortable, I want her fed, and I want 2 guards inside the room with her. Not outside the room. Inside. She speaks to no one until I speak to her." "And the guard, Tor. He talks to no one either." She looked at the fire. "He'll want to talk. That's fine. But the only person he talks to is me." Marin stood. "This is going to be a longer night than I planned." "Yes," Seraphina agreed. "It usually is." Yet she did not sleep. She had known she would not. She sat in the lower hall until the storm began to slow, and then she walked to the inner ward in the rain, because she found that moving helped her think more clearly than sitting, and the guards who followed her did not comment on the hour or the weather. They had served her long enough. The capital was quiet in the way cities were quiet in storms. Not silent, but folded inward, the usual noise of night markets and tavern light replaced by the sound of water moving through the drain channels and the low calls of sentries checking their posts. She knew the city by sound the way she knew the palace by step count. She had walked it at every hour, in every season. She had learned it the way she learned everything she needed, thoroughly, without ceremony, in the understanding that knowledge was the only thing that had ever reliably kept her upright. She thought about the woman in her robe. She thought about Darius's face in the doorway. That split second of calculation, there before he'd had time to arrange it into something else. She had been reading him for 9 years. She knew the difference between the face he wore when he was caught doing something he believed was justifiable and the face he wore when he was genuinely afraid of what he had done. Tonight had been the first one. That was its own kind of information. Whatever had happened in Thornwall, whatever arrangement had been made, whatever intermediary nonsense he was going to try to build into a story that explained why a woman she did not know had been sleeping in her bed in her robe before he arrived through the gate, Darius believed, even now, that it was manageable, that she would eventually hear the full version, and the full version would make enough sense that they could move past it. He still thought this was a situation he could navigate. She walked through the rain and let him think that. By the time the storm fully broke, 3 things had happened. Torthegard had, in fact, wanted to talk. He was 18, terrified, and had apparently been given 10 silver marks in a story about a visiting noblewoman who needed discreet access to the Luna's chambers to leave a gift. A story so thin that Seraphina, listening to him recount it in the small room off the lower hall, felt a precise and focused contempt for the person who had assumed it would be enough. The boy had been naive. The person who had used him had known that, selected him for it, exploited it. She told the guards to feed him and keep him comfortable and not to let him send any messages. Kasveth's house steward arrived at the 4th bell, looking like a man who had thought very carefully about whether or not to arrive at all, and had made the wrong choice in the wrong direction. He was a thin man, 50s, with the careful posture of someone who had spent decades being important by being close to important people. He sat across from Seraphina and told her, in 3 successive versions, each one slightly more truthful than the last, what he knew about the authorization of the South Postern Pass. The 3rd version included Lord Kasveth's name. It also included 2 other names. One was a lord of the Eastern Ward named Breveth. The other she did not yet recognize, but it was attached to a specific phrase that made the back of her neck go still. The arrangement that protects the Luna's continued position. She thanked the steward, had him escorted to a room, and said nothing else. Then the woman in her chambers asked to speak. She came to the room herself. The woman was sitting upright on the edge of the bed, still wearing Seraphina's robe now belted properly, her dark hair pulled back from a face that was younger than Seraphina had expected. Mid-20s, she thought, with the particular tightness around the eyes of someone who had been badly frightened and was doing the work of not showing it. The 2 guards stood against opposite walls. Neither spoke. Seraphina stood just inside the door. She did not sit. This was deliberate. "You asked to speak," she said. "Yes." The woman's voice was steadier than her eyes. "Before anything else happens, while it still matters." "Go ahead." The woman looked at the guards. Seraphina did not follow her gaze. "They can stay," Seraphina said. Another pause. Then the woman straightened further, something resolving in her posture like a decision taken. "My name is Inna. I came to the capital 8 days ago from the Keller Valley. I was approached by a man who said his name was Aldrich, but I don't think that was his real name. He said he represented a group of houses that were concerned about the current balance of power in the crown. He said they needed a woman who could pass as court nobility. He said the work was simple and I would be paid and no one would be harmed." She stopped. Seraphina waited. "He told me the king was away, and that I would be placed in the Luna's chambers before his return. He told me I only had to be there, to be seen there, and that after that I would be taken out of the city quietly and given the rest of the payment." Her jaw tightened. "He didn't say anything about the robe. Someone put it on me while I was sleeping. I didn't—" She stopped again. "I didn't understand what it meant until the door opened." Seraphina looked at her for a long moment. The fire was lower now. Outside, the rain had gone to a drizzle. "When did you understand?" Seraphina said. "When I saw your face." Inna looked up at her directly. "I'm sorry. I know what you saw. I know what it was supposed to make you see. I didn't—" She stopped herself a 3rd time. Then, with a particular kind of tired flatness, "I needed the money. That's the whole of it. I needed it badly enough that I didn't ask the right questions." Seraphina was quiet for a moment. She thought about 17 and a table full of men and the specific flavor of a bad decision made from desperation. "Are you willing to say this again in front of witnesses?" she asked. "Not tonight. When I ask." "Yes." Are you willing to name Aldrich? What he looked like? Who else you saw in contact with him? Yes. Serafina nodded slowly. All right. She moved to leave, then stopped at the door. I'm going to have different clothing brought to you. Leave the robe on the bed. She said it without inflection, but they both knew what it meant. Yacht. The sky was beginning to show the first gray at the edges of dark when she returned to the lower hall and found Darius waiting. He had been there for a while, she thought. He had a cup in his hands, actual water this time, not wine, which was either genuine fatigue or a performance of it. And he was sitting at the far end of the table with the posture of a man who had spent several hours thinking and had not arrived at any conclusions that made him feel better. He looked up when she walked in. You talked to her? He said. Yes? What did she tell you? Serafina sat down at the opposite end of the table. She looked at him across the length of it. 8 feet of old oak, scored and marked by years of use, the table where she had managed the capital for 3 weeks in his absence. She told me she was paid to be in that room, that the robe was put on her while she slept, that she was contacted by a man named Aldrich, who represented a group of houses that wanted to disrupt the crown. Something moved in Darius's face. Not quite relief. More like a man hearing the shape of a thing he had already suspected confirmed from outside himself. I told you it was... Don't, she said. He stopped. She looked at him steadily. You told me it wasn't what it appeared. You're right that it was constructed. You're right that someone built that room and that night for me to walk into. But don't stand where you're standing and tell me the story ends there, because I have had 6 hours to think, and I have the gate log, and I have Kasveth steward in a room down the hall, and what I know right now is that someone inside this palace orchestrated every piece of this with specific and detailed knowledge of my schedule and your itinerary and the rotation of my guards. Ul, she put her hands flat on the table. Which means someone talked. Someone gave information. I want to know if that someone is you. The fire cracked. Darius set down the cup. He did not look away from her, which she credited him for. She had seen men twice his size look away from the question when it came out of her mouth. He held her gaze, and the silence stretched between them, and in it she could feel every year of the 9 they had built together pressing against the present like weight against a seam. No, he said. She watched him. I did not give information to anyone who is working against you. Against us. His voice was rougher now, less managed. What happened in Thornwall was... He stopped. Started again. I made decisions I did not tell you about, contacts I did not disclose. There were reasons. Tell me the reasons. He exhaled. Kasveth approached me before I left. He said there were factions within Ashvale's court that had agents inside ours, and that any information I shared with you before the trip could be leaked before I arrived. He said to keep the Thornwall details close. I thought... He looked at the table. I thought I was protecting the negotiation. Serafina was very still. Kasveth told you not to tell me, she said. And you didn't. He said nothing. Kasveth, who I am about to demonstrate, had a direct hand in arranging the scene you found in my chambers. Kasveth told you to keep your plans from your Luna, and you decided that was sound advice. She let the silence hold. What exactly did you think was being protected, Darius? The negotiation, or your ability to make decisions without checking them against someone who has been right more often than you? The question landed the way she intended it to, not as cruelty, but as precision. She was not interested in wounding him. She was interested in the truth having a clear surface to rest on. He looked at her. For the first time since she had found him in her chambers, his face did not contain any calculation at all. It was just tired, just a man sitting across from the person he should have told things to, understanding too late the shape of what his silence had cost. I don't know, he said. She nodded once. She stood and crossed the hall and lifted the sealed city order from the hook by the door and broke the seal herself. Keep the gates closed, she said without turning. I want Kasveth detained before breakfast. I want his household records, and I want the full council assembled by mid-morning. She heard Darius's chair push back, heard him rise. Serafina. She turned to face him from the doorway. The gray light from outside was coming in stronger now. The storm was over, the sky clearing in that sharp, washed-out way it did after a long night of rain. You came home, she said, and before you were even through the gate, You had already let someone else decide what I was allowed to know. That is what happened here. She looked at him steadily. I am not ending this conversation. I am starting a different one. But I need you to understand that clearly before the council meets, because when we walk into that room, we will not be walking in as a united front that managed a problem. We will be walking in as two people who have to account for what broke down. That is the only version of this that I am willing to stand behind. He looked at her for a long moment, then quietly, all right. She held his gaze one moment more. Then she turned and walked out into the gray morning light of a capital that did not yet know how close it had come to being torn from the inside. Sek. She was halfway across the inner courtyard when the guard came running. Not walking fast. Running. From the direction of the North Ward, which was where Kasveth's guest chambers were located. And the look on the guard's face was the specific look of someone carrying information that had just changed the shape of everything. She stopped, held up one hand, waited. My Luna. The guard drew up and breathed. Lord Kasveth. What about him? He's gone. His chambers are empty. The North Ward door was opened from inside at some point in the last 2 hours. A breath. His household man went with him, and he stopped. And, she said, we found a letter on Kasveth's writing table, addressed to you. She held out her hand. He placed it in her palm. Her name on the outside in handwriting she did not recognize. Broken seal. Kasveth's, the stag and crown she had seen on 100 pieces of correspondence. She opened it and read it once, fast, then again slowly, and by the second reading her hand was completely still, and the courtyard was completely quiet around her, and the washed gray sky overhead felt very close. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph explained in careful language that Kasveth had only been a participant in a larger arrangement, that the aim of the arrangement was never simply to create conflict between the king and the Luna, but to remove the Luna from power permanently, through means that would appear to be the king's own decision. The second paragraph said that this plan had already been partially executed, that certain documents with Seraphina's seal, which had been copied without her knowledge, had already been sent to 2 border lords and to 1 member of the Great Council, that these documents would arrive within the next 24 hours, that their contents would suggest the Luna had been conducting unauthorized negotiations with Ashvale's court behind the king's back for 2 years. The third paragraph was a single line. Ask the king's head advisor where he was the night before the Thornwall delegation departed. Seraphina folded the letter. She looked up at the guard, at the courtyard, at the walls of the palace she had managed for 9 years, the capital she could walk blind, the kingdom she had helped hold together through 3 border conflicts and 2 succession crises, and a winter that had nearly starved the eastern provinces. The gates were sealed. The council was being summoned. Kasveth was gone, which meant he was either running or he believed he didn't need to stay because the damage was already done. And somewhere in the palace, the king's head advisor was waking up to a morning he had planned very carefully. She closed her hand around the letter. Find me Marin, she said, and send word to the king. Tell him to come to the war room. Tell him to bring no one else. She turned back toward the palace. Behind her, the courtyard was already moving. The war room smelled like tallow and old paper, and the specific cold that settled into stone buildings after a long night of rain. Seraphina had been in this room for less than 4 minutes when Darius arrived, and in those 4 minutes she had done 3 things. She had placed Kasveth's letter flat on the table where the light from the east window would fall across it. She had poured 2 cups of water and left both on the table, and she had positioned herself not at the head of the table where she usually sat, but at the side, facing the door, so that when he came through it she would see his whole face before he had time to find her. He came through alone, as she had instructed. He looked at the letter on the table. He looked at her. Close the door, she said. He did. She waited until he crossed to the table and picked up the letter and read it, and she watched his face the whole time. Not for guilt, she was past hunting for guilt, but for the specific quality of his recognition. Whether the contents of this letter landed on him like confirmation or like surprise. The difference between those 2 things was the difference between a man who had been deceived and a man who had participated in his own deception and was now watching the edge of it catch up to him. He read it through. Then he set it down and looked at her, and his face was something she did not immediately have a word for. Not guilt, not surprise exactly, Something between them, something with its own specific flavor, the look of a man who understood that the ground under the past 3 weeks had been softer than he had walked on it. "Brennan," he said. She waited. "My head advisor, Brennan." He touched the letter at the corner, one finger, then pulled his hand back. He was the one who introduced me to Casveth's contact at Thornwall, before the delegation departed. He arranged the first meeting. He looked at the letter again. The night before we left. Brennan arranged the meeting, said it was a preliminary contact, said it needed to stay off the official record because Ashvale's court had informants in the documentation process. And you didn't question that. I questioned it. And then you didn't question it enough. He was quiet. Serafina picked up the letter, folded it, and set it in the inner pocket of her vest. "Brennan has been your advisor for how long?" 7 years. 7 years. She looked at him. "Do you know where he is right now?" "I don't know. I haven't spoken to him since we returned last night. He was in the party, but he went ahead to his own chambers when we came through the gate." He stopped. Something shifted in his jaw. "When I came to find you." She turned to the window. The city below was beginning to wake. She could see movement in the market district, the first carts coming through from the outer districts, people who did not yet know the gates had been sealed and were about to find out. The news would spread fast once it did. Sealed gates were not something a capital forgot quickly. "I need to know everything," she said. "Not the managed version, not the version where you decide in advance what's relevant. Everything from the night before you left to last night at the gate." "Serafina." "I'm not asking as your wife," she said. "I'm asking as the Luna of this kingdom, whose seal is apparently on documents she never wrote, which are currently in transit to the border lords and to a member of my own council." She turned from the window. "So when those documents arrive, in less than 24 hours, I need to be standing on ground that I actually know the shape of. That means I need everything." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he sat down. Not at the head of the table, at the side across from where she had been standing, and when he looked up at her, she understood that this was its own kind of signal. A man sitting down in a room he had always occupied as though it were his alone, choosing not to. She sat across from him, and he talked. It took 40 minutes. She did not interrupt except to ask for specific dates, specific names, the exact phrasing of things that had been said to him that he had absorbed and acted on without recording. The picture that assembled itself was not one she found satisfying. Not because it was damning, it was complicated in the way that genuinely human failures were complicated, full of small decisions that had seemed sensible in isolation and catastrophic in sequence. Brennan had built the thing the way a careful man built anything dangerous, slowly, with long pauses between steps, each piece introduced at a moment when the previous piece had already been normalized. He had started with Casveth, then the Thornwall contact, who was not an Ashvale agent, but one of Breveth's men. Then the instruction to keep the specifics from Serafina, framed as operational security, presented at exactly the moment when Darius was most invested in the Thornwall outcome, and most likely to accept a reason that let him act without the friction of her involvement. Then, and this was the piece she had not fully seen yet, a series of documents that Darius had signed in the second week at Thornwall that he had believed were preliminary trade agreements, brought to him by Brennan for routine signature, which apparently bore enough resemblance in their format to the authorization documents Serafina used that her seal could be replicated from their structure. She let him finish. "Did the trade agreements actually exist?" she said. "Yes, they exist. They're real agreements. But you signed them in a format that gave Brennan access to enough of my authorization structure to copy my seal." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't understand that at the time." "I know you didn't." She looked at her hands on the table. "That's the piece of this I can actually work with." He looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means the forgery is demonstrable. If the documents they're sending to the border lords carry my seal, but were produced using a copied format, and Brennan did that, not someone with actual access to my instruments, there will be inconsistencies. My seal master will see them." She lifted her eyes. "Which means the moment those documents arrive, if I have already summoned the council and already put Brennan in a room, the timeline becomes visible. The forgery becomes visible, but only if I move before the documents do." Darius was watching her with an expression she recognized from a very different context, from the moments in early councils when she had laid out a position and he had heard somewhere in the construction of it that she was 3 steps ahead of a room that thought it was 1 step ahead of her. "You've been building this since you read the letter," he said. "I've been building this since I found Tor missing from his post." She stood. "I need Brennan located and contained before the council meets. I need your authorization for that, publicly, visibly, in writing, so there is no version of this morning where it looks like the Luna acted unilaterally against the king's advisor while the king looked the other way." She looked at him directly. "That's what they want the story to look like. I need it to look like something else." He held her gaze. "What do you need from me?" "Write the order, your hand, your seal. Brennan is to be held in the West Wing under palace guard pending a full security review. Standard language. Do not name the specific suspicion yet. That comes in the council." She paused. "And when you write it, do not consult anyone. Not a secretary, not another advisor. You write it yourself and you bring it to me." He looked at her for another moment. Something moved in his face. Not the calculation she had seen in the corridor last night, but something older, something that had been sitting under the calculation and was now closer to the surface. "All right," he said. He left. She stood at the war room table alone and allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of something that was not quite stillness, more like the feeling of standing on a rope bridge in high wind and choosing, consciously, not to look down. 10 seconds. Then she turned to the door and called for Marin. "What's up?" Brennan was not in his chambers. This information arrived via Marin's face before Marin said a word, and Serafina absorbed it without letting her expression change because the guard relay team behind Marin was watching, and what they saw on her face right now would be what circulated through the palace guard within the hour. "How long ago?" she said. "Chambers were cleared before dawn. His personal man says he dismissed him after the midnight bell with instructions to wake him at the 6th. When the man went back, the room was empty." Marin's voice stayed flat. "He didn't take much. Travel bag, some clothing, left his official seals on the desk." Left the seals, she noted that. A man who left his official seals behind was a man who understood that his official role was already finished. He was not running from an accusation he planned to fight. He was concluding. "He had help," she said. "Almost certainly. That much advance clearing in that time. Someone opened a way for him." "Same route as Kasveth." "We're checking. South Postern was the one confirmed opening. There may have been another." Serafina considered. Kasveth running was one problem. Brennan running was a different one. Brennan was the king's head advisor, and his disappearance in the same night as this particular set of events would create a visible gap in the palace structure that every lord on the council would see and start filling with their own theory before she had the chance to fill it with the truth. She needed to move faster than the gap. "When does the council assemble?" she said. "You called for mid-morning. At this pace, fully assembled by the 2nd hour after dawn. Move it to the 1st hour." She saw Marin's slight adjustment. "I know, do it anyway." Marin went. Serafina crossed the corridor to the side chamber where Inna had been moved. A smaller room, warmer, with the fire kept up and a meal brought. The woman was dressed now in plain clothing, her dark hair pulled back simply, and she was sitting at the small table with a cup she wasn't drinking from in a posture Serafina recognized, the posture of someone who had made a decision and was waiting to learn what the decision had cost them. She looked up when Serafina entered. "Both of them are gone," Serafina said. "The man who organized this, Kasveth, and the king's advisor, they left before dawn." Inna's jaw tightened. "That means I'm the one left to answer for it." "Only if I let it work that way." Serafina pulled the other chair from the wall and sat down across from her, which was not how she usually sat in a room with someone she was assessing, and she did it deliberately. "You said you'd name Aldrich. Describe him. You said you'd speak before witnesses." "I will." "I'm going to need more than that. I need you to walk me through every contact, every location, how the payment was arranged, how the message was delivered that told you where to go and when." She held the woman's gaze. "I know you were used. I know you didn't architect this, but the council is going to assemble in roughly 2 hours, and I need to be standing in that room with more than a letter from a man who is no longer here." Inna was quiet for a moment. Then she put the cup down and looked at Serafina with the directness of someone who had decided to spend something they couldn't afford to hold back. "You're going to protect me through this." "I'm going to tell the truth," Serafina said, "which is that you were recruited as a prop by people who had a specific political aim. The truth, in this case, is also your best protection. She paused. But I need it whole. Not the version that makes you look best. The whole thing. Another pause. Shorter. All right, Inna said. The hour before the council assembled was the most precise hour Serafina had spent in recent memory. She moved through it the way she had learned to move through any situation where the pressure was external and the clock was visible, methodically, without wasted motion, decisions made in the order they needed to happen rather than the order she would have preferred. She met with the palace sealmaster, who confirmed within 15 minutes of examining the relevant authorization formats that a replication was technically possible from the documents Darius had signed at Thornwall, and that he could demonstrate the inconsistency between a copied seal and the original to any qualified observer. She sent 2 riders to the border lords, not with instructions to intercept the documents, but with instructions to hold any correspondence bearing the Luna's seal pending verification. Legitimate authority used to buy time. She had done it before. She met briefly with 3 individual council members before the full assembly, the ones she assessed as genuinely neutral rather than allied to any of the houses connected to what she was already, privately, calling the arrangement. She gave each of them one specific piece of information, different pieces, calibrated to their specific position and concerns, and she watched each of their faces as they processed it, and told her in the processing which side of this morning they were going to come down on. 2 of the 3 were solid. The third she was not sure of, and the not sure of it sat in her chest the way an unresolved piece always did. A small, specific weight she could not put down and so carried. She found Darius in the corridor outside the council chamber. He had the written order in his hand. His own script, she could see from the slant of it, and his seal pressed into the wax while it was still hot, the impression deeper than the official clerks usually got it. He held it out to her. She took it. She read it once. It was clean. Straightforward. No flourish, no hedging. She had half expected him to want to add language, to soften the edge of it, to preserve some deniability. And he had not. "Council is ready," she said. "I know." She looked at him. "When we go in, I lead." He looked back at her. "I know that too." There was something in the space between them. Not reconciliation, not by any measure, and not what had existed before last night either. Something else, something more like 2 people who had agreed, at least for the length of this morning, on what the truth was and what it required. She did not know what it would look like on the other side of the council chamber. She did not let herself look that far yet. "Darius," she said it quietly, just before she turned to the door. "Whatever comes out in there, I need you to not flinch from it." He was quiet for a moment. "Even the parts that are mine. Especially those." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, and she turned to the door, and she put her hand on it, and she pushed it open. The council chamber was full. 23 lords, 2 guildmasters, the kingdom's high marshal, and 3 regional representatives sat at the long curved table. 23 faces turned toward the door as she walked in, and she felt the specific quality of the room's attention like a physical thing, the weight of people who had been pulled from sleep and given no explanation and were now full of their own theories and their own fears and their own calculations about what this morning was going to cost them. She walked to the head of the table and did not sit. She looked at the room. "Thank you for coming at short notice," she said. "I'm going to tell you exactly what happened in this palace last night, and I'm going to tell you in full, and I'm going to ask this council to act on what you hear. But before I begin, I need to account for 2 absences." She let the silence hold for 1 beat. "Lord Casveth is not in this chamber because Lord Casveth left the capital before dawn. Brennan of the King's Advisory Office is also absent for the same reason." The room did not erupt. It went very still. That particular quality of stillness, 23 people absorbing the same information and choosing, all at once, not to speak first, was the most dangerous kind of quiet that a council chamber could produce. She had learned that a long time ago. She stood in it and looked at every face in turn, and she did not hurry. "I'm going to tell you why," she said. And Lord Brevith, seated at the midpoint of the curved table, reached into his vest and produced a folded document she had not seen before, and set it on the table in front of him with a sound that was very small and very loud in the quiet room, and looked at her with an expression that she recognized as a man who had also spent the early morning hours preparing. "Before you do, my Luna," he said, Perhaps you can explain this first. He unfolded the document. Even from the head of the table, she could see it. Her seal. Her signature. And below it, in the formal authorization language she had used 100 times, a directive that she had never written in her life. The document sat on the table like something dead. Serafina did not move toward it. She did not step back. She stood at the head of the curved table with 23 pairs of eyes moving between her face and the paper Breveth had placed in front of him, and she understood in the space of one controlled breath that the ground she had spent all morning mapping had just shifted under her feet in a way she had not fully accounted for. Not the forgery itself. She had known about the forgery. What she had not known was that Breveth had it. That Breveth had been sitting in this chamber for the last 10 minutes with it folded in his vest, waiting for her to open her mouth so he could close it with paper bearing her name. She looked at him. Breveth was a lord of 60 or so, from an old house in the western provinces, the kind of man who had survived 6 different administrations by being useful in small ways to whoever held the largest room. He had a broad face that was easy to mistake for open, and eyes that were neither warm nor cold, but simply watchful in the way that animals near water were watchful. Not aggressive, just aware of everything that moved. She had never trusted him. She had never given him reason to distrust her, which was a different thing, and she had spent 7 years managing that difference carefully. He was watching her now with the expression of a man who had waited a long time to be on the correct side of a table. "Bring it to me," she said. His eyebrows moved just slightly. He had expected something else. She could see that, a flinch, a denial, or the specific overcomposed stillness of someone controlling panic. He had not expected her to hold out her hand and ask for the thing directly. He picked up the document. He did not bring it. He held it in front of him, half raised. "I think the council should see it first, my Luna, given that it concerns arrangements made without the king's—" "Lord Breveth," she said it without heat. "If that document bears my seal, I have the right to examine it before it is read into the council record. That is not a courtesy, that is procedure." She held his gaze. "Bring it to me." The room was very quiet. Breveth held the moment one beat past comfortable. Then he stood and crossed to the head of the table and placed the document in her hand, and she felt in the placing of it the particular intention of a man who had decided this moment was already his, regardless of what she did with the paper. She read it. Her seal, as expected. Her authorization signature copied close enough that a casual observer would not catch the variance in the press of the third letter of her name. The slight lean she put on the downstroke that Brennan apparently had not known to replicate. She could see it. Her seal master could see it. In this room, in this moment, no one else was looking for it. The content of the document was worse than she had anticipated. It was not a simple communication. It was a formal authorization, dated 7 weeks ago, bearing her name, directing a specific transfer of Border Patrol authority in the eastern provinces from the Crown's jurisdiction to a joint oversight body that included 2 of Ashvale's lesser lords. On its face, it read as exactly what Breveth was going to say it was. The Luna of the North quietly negotiating away border authority behind the king's back while he was absent from the capital. She finished reading. She set the document on the table in front of her. She looked at the room. 23 faces. Some genuinely alarmed, some watching her with the specific stillness of men who already knew what the document said because they had been informed in advance that it would appear. She counted 4 of those. Added Breveth. 5 men who had known this moment was coming. And behind her, at the right edge of the table, Darius. She did not look at him. She was aware of him in the way she was always aware of everything she was not looking at, as information, as weight, as a variable whose current state she needed to account for. She heard his breathing change when Breveth had produced the document, a very small shift in rhythm that she had catalogued and filed and would return to later. "This document is a forgery," she said. The room absorbed it. Breveth sat back down with the ease of a man who had been waiting for exactly that sentence. "My Luna, those are serious words." "Yes," she agreed. "They are. And I can demonstrate the forgery with physical evidence. My seal master examined the authorization format used in this document this morning and can attest to the replication inconsistencies between this seal and my verified instrument." She paused. "However, Lord Breveth, I'm more interested right now in how you came to be in possession of it." The room shifted. Not much. Enough. Breveth's expression did not change significantly, but his hands, she noticed, moved from the table surface to his lap. It was delivered to me. By whom? I received it anonymously. As a concerned party, I felt obligated to bring it before the council. You received a document bearing the Luna's seal anonymously, and rather than bringing it to the palace sealmaster for verification, you brought it directly to a council chamber. She let the sentence sit. That's an interesting sequence of choices. I brought it here because the council is the appropriate body to adjudicate disputes. A document of unknown provenance bearing forged official seals is a security matter, not a dispute. She looked at him without expression. Unless you had reason to believe it was genuine. Brevith's face went through something small and fast that was not quite discomfort. I had reason to believe the council should see it. Because someone told you to bring it here this morning. Silence. She let the silence run. 23 people breathing, the fire on the south wall cracking, the specific sound of a room full of men recalculating. I want to be very clear about what is happening, she said. Last night, an orchestrated scheme was executed inside this palace with the aim of damaging the crown's internal stability. The key participants, Lord Casveth and the king's head advisor Brennan, left the capital before dawn, which I will note is not the behavior of men who believe they had done nothing wrong. She did not look at Darius yet. This document is a component of that scheme. It was produced using a copied authorization format and delivered to at least one member of this council in advance of this morning's assembly, which tells me that the people who built this scheme anticipated being found out and built a second layer into it, a layer designed to make the investigation of the scheme look like the crime itself. The room was very still. Brevith said, "Or the document is genuine and the Luna is now constructing a narrative to explain it away." She looked at him. He met her eyes, and in his eyes she saw something she had not seen there before. Not confidence exactly, but the specific expression of a man who had made a bet and was far enough into it that walking back was no longer an option. He was committed. Whatever had been promised to him, whatever position or power or debt relief was waiting on the other side of this morning, he had already accepted it. She was not going to talk him out of the chamber. She was going to have to defeat him inside it. "My sealmaster," she said, "is prepared to come before this council today and demonstrate instrument in hand the specific inconsistencies between this seal and my verified authorization mark." She paused. "Are you prepared to explain how the document came to you, who delivered it, and when the contact was first made?" He said nothing. She waited. From behind her she heard Darius shift. She still did not look at him, but she heard it, the specific sound of him deciding whether to speak, the half intake of breath that preceded a sentence he was weighing. She willed him, without turning, to hold it. Not yet. Not yet. He held it. One of the neutral lords, a man named Aldwin from the northern provinces, white-haired and careful, the kind of man who said very little and meant all of it, leaned forward and said quietly, "My Luna." The king's advisor is absent from this chamber on the same morning this document appears before us. Can you speak to why? She looked at Aldwin. Brennan left the capital before dawn. We are working to determine his route and his destination. His departure is being treated as voluntary flight pending investigation. She paused. Lord Aldwin, I want to be direct with you. I believe Brennan was the primary architect of both the events of last night and this document. I believe Lord Casveth was a participant. I believe that someone in this chamber today was given this document with explicit instructions to produce it at this meeting before I could present the full account of what happened. She held Aldwin's eyes. I am not going to be able to tell you, in this moment, whether there are others in this room who knew what was coming this morning. What I can tell you is that I am going to find out. A lord from the Eastern Ward, a younger man named Reth, whose house was one she had always watched carefully, said, "And what of the king, my Luna? He was present when this situation in the palace occurred. What is his account?" The room turned, all of it, the weight of it, toward the right side of the table. She turned too. Darius was sitting with his hands flat on the table, and his face was the face of a man who had been waiting for the question the way you waited for a wound to finish doing what it was going to do. He looked older than he had looked last night. Not diminished, she would not have called it diminished, but stripped of something, the specific layer that high authority put on a man over time, the automatic assumption that a room would wait for him to frame things. He said, My head advisor manipulated my access to information before and during the Thornwall delegation. He used my signature on legitimate documents to produce a copying frame for the Luna's authorization mark. He introduced me to contacts that were not who he said they were, and he gave me specific instructions to keep details of the delegation from the Luna on the basis of a security concern that I now understand was fabricated. He stopped. His voice was steady. She gave him that. I followed his guidance. I made that decision, and I made it without sufficient skepticism. And the consequences of that decision are part of what this council is now looking at. He looked at Breveth. The document is a forgery. I will stand with the Luna's account. Breveth looked at him for a long moment. Then Breveth said, "With respect, my king, that is a very convenient position for a man whose Luna sealed the Capitol gates last night." The room cracked. Not loudly. It cracked the way old timber cracked, a sound that was small relative to what it signaled, a sound that meant something structural had given way. 3 lords began speaking at once. Aldwin raised his hand and the 3 stopped, but others started, and Seraphina stood at the head of the table and felt the controlled momentum of the morning beginning to come apart at the seams in the specific way that rooms full of frightened men with competing interests came apart when they hit a wall they couldn't see around. She had planned for this. She had planned for exactly this. The moment when Breveth or someone like him pushed hard enough that the room stopped being a council and started being a crowd, because crowds were what the arrangement had been built to produce. Crowds did not examine seal marks. Crowds did not ask who delivered what to whom and when. Crowds picked a side and moved. She needed to stop it becoming a crowd. She said loudly and without inflection, "Enough." The room did not immediately comply. She said it again, the same volume, the same flat authority, and the second time the room went quiet. The way rooms went quiet when the person speaking had made it clear they would simply continue until it did. She looked at Breveth. "You want me to account for sealing the gates," she said. "I will account for it. I sealed the Capitol gates last night upon discovery of a coordinated breach of palace security that involved a bribed member of my guard rotation, unauthorized access to my private chambers, and the confirmed presence of at least one operative connected to a group of houses working against the stability of the crown. That is a security action within the Luna's authority as defined by the House Compact, which you are welcome to have read into the record." She paused. "Now, I have given you a full account. You produced a document you claim was delivered to you anonymously, and you have declined to explain the circumstances of its delivery. The Council can decide which of those 2 positions constitutes transparency." Breveth's face was tight now. The earlier ease was gone, not replaced by panic, he was too seasoned for panic, but by the particular flatness of a man whose play had not gone the way he expected and was now running calculations on what remained. What remained, she was thinking, was not much. What remained was the forgery itself, and Inna, and the gate log, and Casveth's letter, and Darius's testimony, and the seal master. What remained on Breveth's side was a room full of men who were frightened and uncertain and had been given a document they did not have the tools to evaluate. She could win this. She had come into this chamber this morning believing she could win it, and she still believed that, and that belief was the rope she was holding on to while the ground under her feet felt like water. She said, "I am going to request that the seal master be brought before this council this afternoon. I am going to request that Inna, the woman who was placed in my chambers last night, testify before this council about the circumstances of her recruitment and the contact she had with the operative known as Aldrich. I am going to submit the gate log and Casveth's letter as evidence for the record." She looked at the room. "And I am going to ask that Lord Breveth remain available to the council to account for the chain of custody of the document he produced today." Breveth stood. "I do not answer to the Luna's investigation," he said. "I answer to this council, and this council has not yet voted on whether to accept her account or examine—" "You answer to the crown," Seraphina said, and the flatness in her voice was the specific flatness of a woman who had stopped being careful and started being certain. "And the crown is asking." The room went very still. And then a sound she had not anticipated. A door, the side door of the council chamber, the one used by clerks and messengers, opening without ceremony. One of Marin's junior guards came through it quickly, crossed to where Marin stood along the wall, and put something in her hand. Marin looked at it. Her face did not change, but the specific quality of her stillness changed. The way a soldier's stillness changed when they had just received information that required them to reassess everything that had happened in the last hour. She crossed to Serafina. She said very quietly, "Brennan was stopped at the Greyford Bridge. He did not get out." A pause. "He is asking to speak to you, only to you. He says he has documentation. He says, his words, that what he gave Casveth and Breveth was not everything he had." Serafina looked at the room. At Breveth standing, his chair pushed back, his face doing something complicated. At Darius watching her from the right side of the table. At 23 lords who were waiting to see which way the stone fell. She had spent all morning building toward this moment. She had built it carefully, brick by brick, out of evidence and procedure and the specific kind of patient authority that did not announce itself. She had believed, walking into this chamber, that she was the one who understood the shape of the battlefield. She looked at Maren, then she looked at the room. "This council will recess," she said. 2 hours. Breveth said, "On whose authority?" "Mine," she said. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. She picked up the forged document from the table and walked toward the side door. And the room that had been a crowd a moment ago went silent around her. And she pushed the door open and stepped through it into the cold corridor beyond. Behind her, she heard Darius stand. She heard his chair scrape. She heard him follow. And she understood, in the corridor's cold air with her hand still on the door, that what Brennan had waiting at the Greyford Bridge was either the thing that ended this or the thing that made it something else entirely. Something she had not yet planned for, something that would require her to make a choice she could not take back. She had always known that the most dangerous moment in any confrontation was not the attack. It was the moment just after you had survived the first one and had to decide whether you were still the same person you had been before it landed. She started walking. The corridor outside the council chamber was 23 steps long. Serafina counted them without thinking, the way she always counted, because counting was what her mind did when the rest of it was working on something that had not resolved yet. Brennan stopped at the Greyford Bridge, asking to speak, saying he had documentation, that what he had given Casveth and Breveth was not everything. She turned that over as she walked. Not everything. Which meant Brennan had built himself a reserve. A man who built a reserve was a man who had always planned to be caught, or at minimum had planned for the possibility and decided to be useful to whichever side reached him first. That was a specific kind of mind. She had dealt with that kind of mind before. The important thing to understand about men who kept reserves was that the reserve was not loyalty. It was currency. He would spend it on whoever gave him the best price for it, and right now the best price on the table was her. She stopped at the end of the corridor. Darius had followed her out. He was 4 steps behind, and when she stopped, he stopped too, and they stood in the cold air of the passage with the sound of the recess beginning to filter under the council chamber door. Voices rising, chairs scraping, 23 men all trying to get to each other before the 2 hours was up. "You're going to Greyford," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "I'm coming." She looked at him. "No." "Serafina, I need you in that chamber when it reconvenes. I need a body in that room who cannot be removed from it, who carries the crown's authority, who can hold Breveth in place if he decides the recess is his opportunity to do something with what he has left." She held his gaze. "If we both walk out of this palace right now, the room becomes ungoverned. Breveth has at least 3 lords in there who are waiting for exactly that." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working through it, the calculation, but also something else underneath the calculation, something that was not political at all and that he was choosing, in this moment, not to say. "Maren goes with you," he said. "Maren was already going with me. And you come back before the 2 hours is up." "I intend to." He held her eyes another beat. Then he looked at the floor, a brief downward motion that was not submission and not defeat, but something more like a man acknowledging a weight. When he looked back up, his face had the quality she had seen in him at the table, stripped of the layer, just the actual structure of the man underneath it. "Be careful," he said. She had heard him say those words to her before, in other contexts, in the early years when they still said things like that freely. She had not heard them in a while. She registered the sound of them, and then she turned and walked toward the East Passage and did not let herself carry it further than that. The ride to Greyford took 40 minutes at the pace Maren set, which was faster than comfortable and slower than reckless. the kind of pace that said something specific about Marin's assessment of the situation without requiring her to say it aloud. The bridge was an old stone crossing at the edge of the capital's jurisdiction, where the road south split toward the lowland provinces. The Greyford garrison was small, 8 men, a fortified way station, a holding room that was used for customs disputes, and the occasional traveler who arrived with paperwork that did not match their cargo. Serafina had inspected it twice. She knew its dimensions. She knew the light came in from the east-facing window only in the mornings, and that the holding room smelled like damp rope and old iron, and that a man kept in it for more than an hour started to feel the walls. Brennan had been there since just before dawn. He was sitting at the small table when they brought her in, and she took him in quickly and without pause, the specific inventory of a person who had been through a bad night and knew it. 61, thin in the shoulders, with the indoor pallor of a man who had spent decades in advisement chambers rather than daylight. His hands were on the table. He had not been restrained, she noted. The garrison commander had read the situation correctly. A man who was asking to talk was a man you kept comfortable enough to keep talking. He looked at her when she came in, and his expression did the thing expressions did when they were trying to communicate sincerity to a person who had no remaining reason to credit it. She sat down across from him without speaking. He said, "I didn't know about the woman in your chambers." "I don't believe you," she said. Not with anger, as information. His jaw tightened. "I knew about the document, the forgery. I knew about the approach to Kasveth and to Brevith. I was the one who structured the original plan." He stopped. "The woman was Kasveth's addition. I was told it was a documentation play, that the forgery would be sufficient to create enough doubt in the council to buy time for the larger arrangement. The personal element—" He stopped again. "That was not my design." She looked at him. A man who wanted her to understand the specific shape of his culpability, who had decided that the best asset he had left was a distinction between what he had planned and what he had failed to prevent. She gave him nothing. "You said you have documentation," she said. "What documentation?" He reached into his coat slowly, with the deliberate visibility of a man demonstrating that he understood the guards behind her were watching every movement, and he produced a bound leather folder. He placed it on the table between them. He did not push it toward her. He left it equidistant, which was its own kind of statement. "Everything is in there," he said. "Every communication between myself and Brevith going back 14 months. The original proposal, which came from Brevith's house, not mine. The letters between Brevith and the 2 border lords regarding the authorization documents, with Brevith's seal on every one. The name of the man who approached Inna, his actual name, not the Aldrich cover, and the record of a financial arrangement between Brevith's estate and 3 members of this council." He paused. "Not Kasveth, 3 others." She did not touch the folder. She said, "Why?" He looked at her. "Why did I keep it? Why did you build the play in the first place? You have served this king for 7 years. Walk me through the reasoning of a man who decides to do this." He was quiet for a moment. His hands moved on the table, a small adjustment, and she watched the movement the way she watched everything, cataloging, without editorial. "Brevith approached me 14 months ago," he said. "He had information about a debt arrangement Darius had made during the second border conflict. A private arrangement, off the formal ledger, with a merchant house in the Southern Territory. The kind of arrangement that is not illegal but is," he searched for the word, "inconvenient for the Crown's position in the Eastern trade negotiations. Brevith had leverage on the king," she said, "on the king's credibility." "Yes." He looked at the table. "He came to me because he understood that a direct approach to Darius would not work. Darius does not respond to leverage the way most men respond to leverage. He pushes back. He escalates." A pause. But an approach through an advisor, someone who could frame it as prudent management of a political risk, that was different. Brevith wanted the Eastern Border Authority restructured. He wanted the Luna's position reduced, not eliminated. Reduced, subordinated to a council oversight body that he could control. He said the documentation play would accomplish it without direct conflict. That the Luna would step back from certain functions when faced with enough doubt about her own conduct. She let that sit. The light in the holding room had shifted slightly, the sun moving in the east-facing window. She did not look at it. "He thought I would step back," she said. Brennan looked at her, and in his face she saw for the first time something that was not calculation and was not performance. Just a man who had spent 14 months working a plan built on a fundamental misreading of its primary subject. Yes, he said. She looked at the folder on the table. She thought about Brevith in the council chamber, standing with his chair pushed back, the ease in him when he had produced the document, the specific confidence of a man who had been 14 months in preparation and believed he had accounted for every variable. She thought about the three unnamed lords. She thought about the document that was in her vest pocket right now, the one bearing her copied seal, and the seal master she had positioned to testify this afternoon, and Inna, who would speak before witnesses. She thought about the folder on the table. She picked it up. She opened it and read for 6 minutes, quickly and without interruption. Marin stood behind her and said nothing. The garrison guards did not move. Brennan sat across from her and watched her read with the expression of a man who had made his bet and was waiting for the outcome with the specific, exhausted patience of someone who has stopped being able to affect things. The folder was what he said it was. More than what he said it was, actually. There was a letter at the back between Brevith and an individual identified only by a title that belonged to a position in the Crown's administrative structure that was close enough to Serafina's own office that the blood in her hands went briefly cold when she read it. She closed the folder. She looked at Brennan. "You are going to come back to the capital," she said. "You are going to come back now, today, before this recess ends. You're going to sit in a chamber I designate, and you are going to wait while I determine what testimony this council requires from you." She paused. "If you provide complete testimony and it is consistent with what is in this folder, I will recommend that your cooperation be entered into the formal record. I am not in a position to promise you anything beyond that, and I would not insult your intelligence by trying." She picked up the folder and stood. "But if you run again, if you are not in that chamber when I call for you, then this folder becomes the entirety of your story and you have no voice in how it is read." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "I underestimated you. I knew you were capable. I did not—" He stopped. "I built the entire architecture of this around the assumption that the king's position was the one worth targeting, that you were the secondary structure." He looked at his hands. "I understand now that I had it backwards." She did not respond to that. She turned to Marin. "Bring him back. Separate from my party. I want him in the East holding room before the recess ends." Marin moved. Serafina walked back out into the morning light and stood for a moment beside her horse, with the folder in her hand and the cold air coming off the river and the sound of the water moving under the Greyford Bridge steady and indifferent to everything that had happened in the last 18 hours. 3 lords she had not identified. In that folder, in Brevith's own hand, references to financial arrangements with 3 council members. She had seen 2 names written in full. The third was abbreviated, an initial and a house reference that pointed toward the northern ward. Aldwyn. She stood very still. She thought about Aldwyn at the council table this morning. His careful questions, his measured voice, the specific quality of his attention when she had spoken. She had assessed him as neutral. She had counted him among the solid center. She had built her positioning for the recess partly on that assessment, if Aldwyn was not neutral. She mounted her horse. She looked down the road toward the capital, the walls visible in the distance, the gates she had sealed last night still holding, the city inside them not yet knowing how close the morning had come to going another way. She had 2 hours. Less now. The ride back was 40 minutes. That left her 70 minutes to re-enter that chamber with what she had, and position it in a way that did not let the revelation about Aldwyn destroy the ground she had spent all night and all morning building. Because if Aldwyn was named in that folder and she revealed the folder without preparation, the 3 lords connected to Brevith would have time to align before she could separate them. And a council with 5 aligned members moving in the same direction was a different situation than a council with one. She needed to know which of the 2 names in the folder were the readable ones and which was the initial. And she needed to know it before she walked back into that room. She looked at Marin, who was already mounted, already watching her with the face of a woman waiting for instruction. "Ride ahead," Serafina said. "Get me Calla. Tell her I need the household record cross-referenced against the Northern Ward Lords in the last 14 months. Any payment, any visit, any formal dinner Aldwyn attended where Brevith was also present." She paused. "Tell her I need it in 40 minutes. Marin went. Serafina rode after her at the same fast pace, and the road unrolled beneath her, and the Capitol grew in front of her, and she turned the folder over in her mind the way she turned everything over, without sentiment, without the permission to be afraid of what she was looking at. And she let herself see it whole. The arrangement had not been built to topple the king. It had been built to topple her, to reduce her to a subordinate position from which she could not challenge a council that Brevith had been quietly buying for over a year. The forged documents were the visible layer. The three lords were the structural layer. And Brennan had been the mechanism, the trusted internal hand that turned the lock from inside while Brevith pushed from outside. She had spent the night thinking she was unwinding a conspiracy. She had been unwinding the surface of one. The actual conspiracy was deeper and had been running longer and had more members than she had walked into that council chamber knowing about. And she had 2 hours to decide what to do with that before the recess ended, and Brevith stood up again in a room where he believed he still had majority weight. She thought about what Brennan had said. I built the entire architecture of this around the assumption that the king's position was the one worth targeting. She understood now why Brevith had built it the other way. Because in 14 months of watching this kingdom run, he had arrived at the same conclusion she had arrived at 9 years ago and never said aloud to anyone, that the thing holding Vorn together was not the king's authority. It was hers. And unlike Darius, she could not be redirected with flattery or worn down with friction or managed through an advisor. She had to be removed by being made to look like the threat. She pushed her horse faster. The gate came into view. She could see from the road that it was still sealed. Good. And that there were more people near it than there had been at dawn, merchants and travelers backed up and frustrated and milling in the way of people who had been inconvenienced by power and were not yet certain how long the inconvenience would last. They would have their answer by midday, one way or another. She rode through the personnel gate and into the city and did not slow down until she reached the inner ward, and when she dismounted, Calla was already there, standing in the courtyard with a document in her hand and an expression that said she had found what she had been asked to find and was not pleased with it. Seraphina took the document and read it standing up. Aldwin. A dinner in the Western Estate 3 months ago, both names on the guest list, a payment record from the estate accounts, legitimate on its face, a consulting arrangement, the kind of thing that looked like nothing until it sat next to everything else. Enough. Not a confession. But enough to ask the question in the council chamber with the folder in her hand in front of 23 people, in a way that Aldwin would have to answer or not answer, and either answer would tell the room something. She looked up from the document. Calla was watching her. Merrin had come into the courtyard behind her. Somewhere above, in the palace, Darius was in the council chamber holding a room she had told him to hold, and in the east holding room Brennan was being settled in under guard, and in the council chamber Brevith was spending the last of his recess talking to whoever he could reach. She had 40 minutes. She thought about the version of this morning she had planned last night in the rain, counting windows in the dark, mapping every variable she could see. She had been thorough. She had been meticulous. She had still walked into a room with a piece missing because the piece had been buried 14 months deep in a folder in the coat of a man she had not yet reached. There was a particular feeling that came with that. Not quite failure, then. The morning was not over. The folder was in her hand. She was still standing. Something more like the knowledge that thoroughness had a ceiling, and above that ceiling was the country where you could not plan your way through because the variables were too many, and some of them were behind doors you did not yet know were doors. In that country you did not plan. You decided. She tucked Calla's document inside the folder and handed it to Merrin. When I call for it in the chamber, bring it directly to the table. Don't hand it to anyone else. Don't let it out of your hands between now and then. Merrin took it. And Merrin. She looked at her directly. If Brevith moves to leave the chamber at any point before I am finished, any point, even for a moment, you stop him. Merrin's expression was flat and certain in the way that had made her worth every difficult day of the past 6 years. Understood. Seraphina turned toward the palace entrance. She walked through the doors and up the main corridor and toward the council chamber, and she felt the building around her the way she always felt it. Old stone and cold air and 9 years of memory in every corridor, every stairwell, every window she had looked out of while managing something that needed managing. She had walked into difficult rooms before. She had walked into rooms where the people in them wanted her to fail, wanted her to stumble, wanted her to give them the one wrong word or the one visible flinch that would make everything they planned possible. She had not given them that. She was not going to give them this. She reached the council chamber door. She put her hand on it. And from inside the chamber, before she had pushed it open, before she had crossed the threshold, before she had done the thing she had been walking toward for 40 minutes, she heard a sound she had not expected. Not voices, not the controlled murmur of a recess. Shouting, multiple voices, overlapping, the specific chaotic register of a room that had stopped being a council, a long time before she arrived back at its door. She heard Darius's voice above the others, not shouting, but raised in the way she knew he raised it when he was done waiting. And she heard Brevith's voice underneath his, and she heard a third voice she did not immediately place saying something that made the room loud in a completely different way. She pushed the door open. The chamber had not waited for her. Brevith was on his feet. Darius was on his feet. 4 other lords were on their feet. The High Marshal had moved from his place along the wall to the edge of the table. Aldwin, she saw him in the moment before anyone saw her, was seated and very still, the stillness of a man who had made a decision and was sitting inside it. In Brevith's hand was a second document, not the forgery, something else, something smaller, folded once, and he was holding it toward the center of the table with the specific posture of a man who had just played the last thing in his hand and was watching to see what the table did. Every face in the room turned to the door when she entered, including Brevith's. And in Brevith's face, in the fraction of a second before he managed it, she saw the one thing she had not expected to see there. Fear. The room had already broken before she walked back into it. She could see it in the configuration of bodies, who was standing, who had moved away from whom, the specific geometry of a space where alliances had just been rearranged in her absence. Brevith was on his feet at the midpoint of the curved table with the second document in his raised hand and 3 lords standing loose near him, not quite beside him, the careful distance of men who had not yet decided which direction this was going to fall. Darius was at the head of the table, which was not where she had left him, and the fact that he had moved there while she was gone told her something about how the last 20 minutes had gone. The High Marshal stood at the table's edge with the specific posture of a man doing the job of not choosing sides by the sheer force of professional neutrality, and Aldwin, in his chair, hands flat and still, looking at nothing. She walked to the head of the table. Darius stepped back without being asked, not retreat, adjustment, a man who understood what her arriving in that position at this moment meant. She stood and looked at the room, and the room looked back. And in the 2 seconds of quiet before anyone spoke, she took the full measure of what she had walked into. Brevith's fear had lasted less than a second before he had covered it. But fear, in her experience, was the most honest thing a face ever did. He had been afraid when she walked through that door, which meant the second document in his hand was not a winning move. It was a last one. "Put it on the table," she said. He looked at her with the reconstructed composure of a man who had made a decision. "This concerns the council, my Luna, not—" "Put it on the table, Lord Brevith." The room was very still. He put it on the table. She crossed to it, read it standing, and understood within 4 lines what it was. A letter. Handwritten, recent. The ink had the quality of something produced in haste, the letters slightly larger than careful writing produced them. It was addressed to the council in aggregate, and it bore Brennan's name at the bottom, and its contents were a preemptive account of his own role in the arrangement, structured to present itself as a confession but shaped in the specific choices of what it included and what it omitted, to implicate Seraphina's office in the original authorization of the border restructuring. A letter Brennan had apparently written before he ran. A letter Brevith had been sitting on, waiting to see if he needed it. She had been 40 minutes at the Greyford Bridge. In 40 minutes, Brevith had produced a letter that contradicted the account of a man who was currently sitting in the east holding room of this palace waiting to deliver testimony. A letter designed to arrive before its author did. A letter that would land differently on this council if it arrived first, if the room had time to absorb its version of events before Brennan's actual voice entered the chamber. She put the letter down. She looked at Brevith. She said, "Brennan is in the east holding room." The room absorbed that. She watched Brevith absorb it. The composure held, but his hands, the letter, still in contact with his fingertips, moved slightly against the table's surface. A very small adjustment, the kind of movement that happened below the level of intention. "He was stopped at the Greyford Bridge before dawn," she continued. "He asked to speak. I went to him. He provided documentation of the arrangement, every communication, every letter, every financial record between himself and the parties involved, and he is prepared to testify before this council this afternoon. She looked at the room. Lord Breveth, you have just produced a letter bearing Brennan's name. I suggest you consider carefully what it means that the man whose name is on that letter is currently in this building. Breveth said, He'll say whatever you've told him to say. He'll say what the documentation supports, she said, which is available for examination by any member of this council who wants to see it before we proceed. She turned to Marin, who was in the doorway. Marin crossed to the table and placed the bound leather folder flat on the surface. Serafina put her hand on it. 14 months of correspondence. Every financial arrangement. 3 names from this council. She did not open the folder. She let it sit. Lord Breveth, I'm going to ask you one question, and I'm going to ask it in front of every person in this room. And I want you to understand that the answer you give in the next 30 seconds is the answer that will be read into the formal record of this council and will follow your house forward from this morning. She held his eyes. Did you authorize and fund the scheme that produced a forged document bearing the Luna's seal, suborned a member of the Royal Guard, and placed an operative in the Luna's private chambers with the aim of destabilizing the crown? Silence. 23 people not breathing. Breveth looked at her. His hands were still. His face was the face of a man who had spent 14 months on a plan and was now standing at the precise point where the plan ended and what came after it had not yet been written. He said nothing. She waited. He said, I want council representation before I answer any. That is your answer, she said. And she turned from him because the turn itself was the statement, and she looked at the Marshal and said, Lord Marshal, take Lord Breveth to holding pending formal examination. He is not to communicate with any member of this council or their staff until the examination is complete. The Marshal moved. He was a large man, the kind of large that came from actual use, and he crossed to Breveth with 2 of his men, and Breveth, after one long moment in which he looked at the room and found that the room had shifted, that the 3 lords who had been near him were no longer near him, that the bet had ended and the accounting was beginning, Breveth did not resist. He walked out. The door closed. What followed was not swift. Serafina had learned over 9 years that the dramatic moment in any confrontation was almost never the one where the enemy left the room. The dramatic moment was the one everyone remembered. What came after it, the documentation, the formal statements, the careful reconstruction of a sequence of events in language precise enough to become law, was longer and harder and produced no moments anyone would retell. It was the work that made the moment mean something. She did it. She did 3 hours of it, with the council, methodically, Brennan brought in at the 2nd hour and seated at the table where everyone could see him and where his presence confirmed by the simple fact of his existing in the room that the letter Breveth had produced was a document written by a man who had not yet decided how his own story ended. He was not a good man. She did not present him as one. She presented him as a witness whose documentation was verifiable and whose testimony, cross-referenced against the material in the folder, gave the council a complete account of the arrangement from its origin to its execution. She presented the sealmaster. She presented Inna, who spoke for 20 minutes in the flat, careful voice of a woman who had decided that the only thing left to spend was the truth, and who named the man she had known as Aldrich with enough physical detail, height, left-handed, a scar on the inside of the right wrist, that the council's investigator had a starting point. She presented Casveth's letter. She presented the gate log. She presented Calla's cross-reference on Aldwin, at which point the chamber went through a specific kind of silence that was different from all the other silences of the morning. The silence of men recalibrating a person they had believed they understood. Aldwin sat through it with his hands on the table, and when Serafina looked at him and said, quietly, that the record showed a financial arrangement between his estate and Breveth's over a period of 11 months, he did not deny it. He said, in a voice that had aged 20 years in the last 3 hours, that he had believed the arrangement was a trade matter, that he had not known what it was funding. She watched his face while he said it, and she did not know, entirely, whether it was true. She filed that uncertainty in the place where she filed things she could not yet resolve, and she moved forward. At the end of the 3rd hour, she called for the formal record. The formal record took another 30 minutes to draft in language the council ratified. It documented the conspiracy. It named Breveth, Casveth, and Brennan as primary parties. It entered Brennan's cooperation into evidence. It noted the Aldwin matter as under ongoing examination. It established the forged documents as fraudulent by seal master testimony and ordered the border lords informed. It called for the exile of Breveth and Casveth upon completion of formal examination, and it stripped Brennan of his title and advisory position, recommending a period of internal custody contingent on the completeness of his continued cooperation. She read it twice before she signed it. Darius signed it after her. When the council filed out, the chamber was empty in the specific way that rooms were empty after long, difficult use. Not peaceful, just depleted, the air carrying the residue of everything that had been said in it. She stood at the head of the table and felt the depletion herself, a bone-deep tiredness that was different from the tiredness of a sleepless night. This was the tiredness of sustained precision, of holding a structure in place by the force of attention alone for hours longer than it wanted to hold. She stood in it and let it be what it was. Darius was the last one out of the room besides her, and he stopped at the door the way he had stopped in the corridor that morning, not quite leaving, not quite staying. She heard him and did not turn immediately. Seraphina. She turned. He was standing in the doorway with his hand on the frame, and the light from the corridor behind him was different now. Afternoon light, warmer, the kind that came in from the western windows after midday. She had lost track of the hours. She did the calculation. Nearly 16 hours since she had walked into her own chambers and found what she had found. 16 hours that had changed the shape of everything and resolved nothing between the two of them, and left them standing here, in this depleted room, with the public work done and the private work still exactly where they had left it. She looked at him. He said, "I should have told you everything. Before Thornwall. After Brennan came to me. There were a dozen moments where I could have brought it to you and didn't. And I told myself different reasons at different times, and none of them were the real one." She waited. "The real one," he said, "is that I have spent 9 years watching you be right more often than me, and I have spent 9 years being grateful for it and resenting it in almost equal measure, and somewhere in that resentment I made space for a man who told me I could protect something on my own." He looked at the floor. "Brennan didn't create that space. He found it. I made it." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what it cost a man like Darius Thorne to say that. Not the words. The words were just words, but the understanding underneath them. The understanding that the thing Brennan had exploited was not naivety or poor judgment, but something older and more specifically his, a wound he had been managing privately for years without naming it to her or to himself. She had not known about that wound. She should have. She sat down at the table, not at the head, at the side where she had sat that morning, and she looked at the surface of the table and let herself be tired for the first time since the previous night. "Sit down," she said. He came in. He sat across from her. And they were quiet for a moment, both of them, in the empty room with the afternoon light moving across the old oak table, and the quiet was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was different and more durable than comfortable. "There are things I should have said," she said. "Not last night. Before last night." She did not look at him. She looked at her hands. "I have managed this kingdom so thoroughly for so long that I stopped consulting you on things that were mine to consult you on. Not because I thought you would get it wrong, because somewhere I decided it was faster to do it myself." She paused. Brennan saw that too. He saw that we had stopped, that there was space between us that we had both decided not to name. Darius said, "That doesn't justify. I'm not justifying anything. I'm accounting." She looked up. "What you did was wrong. What I'm telling you is that I was not entirely absent from how it became possible." She held his gaze. "I'm not saying that so you feel better. I'm saying it because I am trying to be accurate, and accuracy matters more to me than a version of this that puts all the weight on one side." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "What do we do?" She considered that. Not the political answer. That was already in motion. The documents signed, the council record made, the arrangements underway. He was not asking about the kingdom. He was asking about the smaller, harder territory that had no formal record and no seal master to verify its contents. "We don't decide that today," she said. "Today I am going to sleep for the first time in a day and a half, and tomorrow I am going to meet with the investigator about the Aldrich identification. And in the coming weeks there will be an examination of Breveth's full network that will require both of us to be present and functioning." She paused. "What we do about the rest of it," We do that the same way we do everything else that matters. Slowly, without pretending we're further along than we are. He nodded once, the smallest motion. She looked at the table. I need you to do one thing, not for the kingdom, for me. What? I need you to stop deciding what I can handle. I need that to be finished. She looked at him directly. Whatever you know, whatever is coming, whatever you're afraid is going to make me think less of you or act in a way you can't predict, I need you to tell me. Not because I'm always going to handle it the way you want me to, but because I cannot build anything on ground I don't know the shape of. He held her gaze. All right, he said, and then after a moment, I mean it. I know, she said. That's the only reason I'm still in this room, Patsy. The gates opened at the 5th bell. She gave the order herself, standing in the inner ward with Marin beside her, and the sound of the city filtering through the stone in the specific register it took on when something had shifted. Not quiet, not loud, the unresolved murmur of a place that knew something had happened and was still deciding what to make of it. She watched the mechanism turn, watched the great east gate move on its hinges, the chain running back through the capstan, the gap widening slowly into an opening wide enough for a cart. On the other side, the crowd that had been building since dawn, merchants, travelers, residents who had been caught outside and spent the day waiting, was visible in fragments through the gap, faces turning toward the opening the way flowers turn toward light, reflexive, without thought. She stayed until the gate was fully open. Then she turned and walked back into the palace. In the weeks that followed, the work was relentless and without ceremony. Breveth's examination took 4 days and produced 3 additional names, not council members, but lesser administrators within the Crown's financial structure, men who had been positioned over years to smooth the movement of funds and documentation. They were removed. The administrative structure was audited. 2 of the border lords required personal meetings, which she conducted herself, with Darius present, in which the full account of the forgery was laid out and the border authority arrangement was formally nullified. Kasveth was located at a lowland estate belonging to a distant relation and brought back without incident. He was stripped of rank and title at a formal hearing. He sat through the hearing with the posture of a man who had spent the weeks since his flight arriving at a specific and private understanding of where his choices had led him, and when the sentence of exile was read, he received it without expression. Brennan remained in internal custody. He testified 3 more times, each session producing additional detail that cross-referenced cleanly against what the folder had already established. She did not speak to him personally after the council. She left that to the investigator. There was nothing left between her and Brennan that required her presence. The accounting was in the record, and the record was permanent, and personal confrontation would have satisfied something she did not want to satisfy. Inna she dealt with differently. She had the woman brought to her office 6 days after the council, when the immediate pressure had reduced enough that the conversation could be what it needed to be, rather than what the investigation required. She gave Inna a formal letter clearing her name. She gave her transport south, to wherever she wanted to go, with enough provision to make the first several months not a crisis. She did this without announcement and without entering it into any record, because it was not a political act, and she did not want it to become one. Inna stood in the office door before she left and looked at Serafina with an expression that was not quite gratitude. Gratitude was too simple for what the last weeks had been, and said, "I will not waste it." "Good," Serafina said, and that was all. The law took the longest. She had told Darius in the council chamber on that first morning that the record would show what had broken down. The record did. But records were not prevention, and what she had discovered in those 16 hours was not simply a conspiracy, but a structural vulnerability, the specific gap between the king's authority and the lunas that men like Breveth could find and widen over time. A gap that existed because the compact had been written by men who assumed good faith among its holders and had not built sufficient architecture around that assumption. She spent 3 months drafting the provision. She worked with 2 constitutional scholars and 1 administrative judge, and she did not hurry it because bad law written fast was worse than slow law written right. The provision formalized the Luna's advisory role, made mandatory the dual signature process for certain classes of border and administrative authority, and established an independent review process for any authorization documents bearing the Luna's seal that were not accompanied by a witnessing record. Darius signed it without amendment. She had expected him to want to amend something. He did not. He read it completely, asked 2 questions, received 2 answers, and signed. When she raised an eyebrow at the speed of it, he said, without looking up from the document, "It's right. What else would I do?" She had looked at him for a moment. She had not answered, but she had felt in the space of that moment something that was not exactly forgiveness. Forgiveness was a word that implied a transaction, a score settled, a line drawn, but something more like the feeling of ground that had been tested and found not to have shifted as far as it had seemed. Something more like the beginning of a different kind of knowing. Not what they had been before. Something that had been hammered into a different shape by everything that had happened to it and was harder for it, and held its edges differently. She did not know yet if it was enough. She was not certain that certainty was the right standard to hold it to. Asem. The night the provision passed into formal law, she stood at the high window of her chambers, her own chambers, where the fire burned at the level she had set, and the robe on the hook was her own, and the door was oiled and the hinges made no sound. And she looked out at the Capitol below. The city was lit the way it was always lit at this hour. The market fires in the lower district and the torches along the main avenue and the smaller, warmer lights of the residential quarters. Each one a separate life running its own calculation through the dark. She had stood at this window 100 times. She had stood here the night she first came to this palace, and the night of the worst border conflict, and the night after the Eastern flood, when she had been writing relief orders until her hand cramped, and she had needed to stand somewhere quiet for 5 minutes. She stood here now, and looked at the city she had helped hold together, and felt the specific weight of it. Not as pride, she had always been suspicious of pride, but as something more like responsibility clarified. She understood what she was responsible for more clearly than she had understood it 16 hours into a sleepless night with a forged document in her hand and a council chamber coming apart at the seams. She understood it the way you understood things after the crisis had passed and you could see the full shape of what the crisis had shown you. She was responsible for the ground, not the glory of the kingdom, not the narrative of its strength, but the actual, physical, institutional ground on which the people below her built their lives. The market fires, the relief orders, the contracts that held, the administrative processes that did not have gaps in them wide enough for a brevet to walk through over 14 months without being seen. That was the work, not the dramatic confrontations in council chambers. Those were what the work looked like when it had failed and needed to be recovered. The real thing was quieter and longer and less memorable, and she had always known that and had chosen it anyway, every day, for 9 years. She would choose it again. She heard the door. Not her chamber door, the outer door of the sitting room, the one Darius had used occasionally in the early years when they were still in the habit of not announcing arrivals. She heard it open and heard his footstep in the outer room, and then she heard him stop, which meant he could see her silhouette against the window and was waiting to see if she turned. She turned. He was in the doorway between the sitting room and the main chamber, and he was not wearing the formal clothing he'd had on at the signing. He had changed into something plainer, and he looked in the low firelight like someone who had put down a significant weight somewhere and was still adjusting to the change in his own balance. He said, "I didn't want to—" He stopped, started differently. "I wasn't going to say anything. I just wanted to—" He stopped again. She looked at him. He said, "I'm sorry. Not for the council record, for the real thing." He looked at her directly, the way she had asked him to look at her in the most difficult moments. Without the layer, without the management of the expression, just the actual state of the man. For 9 years of letting the space grow between us and calling it something other than what it was. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city made its sounds. Somewhere in the lower district, a cart was moving. Somewhere in the residential quarter, a window closed against the night air. "I know," she said. She looked at him for a long moment longer. Then she looked back at the window, at the city below, at the lights of the place they had built and broken and were in the slow process of learning to hold differently. "Come here," she said. Not warmly, not with the easy warmth of before, which had been real, but had also been, she understood now, a warmth that had let them stop looking at certain things. What she said it with was something more like intention. He crossed the room and stood beside her at the window. They stood without touching, side by side, Looking at the capital of the North in the quiet hours after the formal record had been made, and the provisions had been signed, and the gates that had been sealed in the worst night of the last 9 years had been open for weeks now to everything that moved through them. The gates that had opened as proof that she was still standing, that the ground was still there, that the thing Breveth and Brennan and 14 months of careful planning had tried to take from her was not a title or a position or a seal on a document, but the simple, unglamorous fact of her own judgment, which she had tested in the worst possible conditions and found, at the end of it, that it had held. The city burned its lights below them. She breathed. The work would begin again in the morning, as it always did, with no ceremony and no memory of having been difficult, and she would be there for it. Not because she had survived the worst of it, but because survival had never been the point. The point was the ground. It was always the ground. She looked at it, below her, lit and breathing and continuing, and she let that be enough.